Welcome to the NFL Week 5 wide receiver and cornerback matchups article. I am Jason Gilbo at JGilbo11, taking down basically a thought process of, what wide receivers get the best looks this week in terms of just matchups alone. The article, the written version, is up over on dailyfantasycafe.com if you want to check that out. It is a premium article alongside this podcast. Let's jump into things here. Week 5, we start to kind of get some bye weeks in here. We get the Sunday night game. It's taking out DraftKings. We get the Monday night game. So things are starting to shrink a little bit, getting a little bit more narrow. So looking at the great matchups of the week, let's start with this Philly and Arizona game. Nelson Agholor is a guy I do want to talk about this week. Obviously, you broke off a decent week 1. Hasn't really done much since then. But when you look at things, Nelson Agholor, 86% of his routes out of the slot, which means Tyrann Mathieu is going to be a guy who covers him most of the way. He's been struggling quite a bit in coverage. 0.3 of fantasy points per route allowed, 68% catch rate. I think Aguilar is an intriguing punt option at 3,900 on DK as a wide receiver 3 if you're trying to really jam in Bell and some of those other guys. He might be someone to look at because I think DraftKings did a pretty good job of pricing guys up in the mid-range that maybe you're kind of hoping we're stealing a little bit below, 5K, below 4,500. So I don't mind him this week. In that same matchup here, Jalen Mills has definitely been a guy to target this season. 0.37 fantasy points per route at 1.91 yards for route covered. John Brown obviously looked healthy last week. He's a decent option. He's one of those guys that's been priced up a little bit. He's 5,100 on DK, 62 on FanDuel. When healthy, this guy's one of the guys outside of Larry Fitzgerald that you're really looking at. And Fitz is in a solid matchup as well this week too. We don't need to dive too much into him. I do like it. Obviously, anytime you get a team like Arizona that's going cross country to Philly, it's a little bit of an issue. It may be ugly at times, but I do think that those guys kind of get their own at some point there. So I definitely don't mind those names. Moving forward, if you're playing the FanDuel slate, obviously the Sunday night game's involved. Tyreek Hill's a guy who does, go around and kind of lines up all over. He doesn't run up on any one side over 40% of the time. And 2 Houston corners have allowed, 0.35, over 0.35 fantasy points per route run this season. Hopkins obviously in play for me just in terms of the volume alone, but obviously he's going to see Terrence Mitchell for most of his routes. Hasn't really done all that well this year. Kansas City ranks 24th against wide receiver 1s, allowing 87 yards per game to them. Obviously still definitely some potential in that late night game. I know Kansas City and Houston doesn't really pop off as an exciting game to target, but when we look at things here, those are 2 guys that are in decent matchups. When we get to Green Bay and Dallas here, Des Bryant obviously going up against a Packers secondary that's, struggled for the most part. Going to line up against Kevin King, Demarius Randall. Both have combined for 0.64 fantasy points per route run this year. Bryant, a top option across the board for me this week. Love his price on DraftKings. Don't mind him on FanDuel either. Randall Cobb's probably going to be one of the more popular plays. DraftKings did an excellent job pricing him up to 6,700, 66 on FanDuel's, quite a steal. It does look like that, Devontae Adams is going to be basically a game time decision. He hasn't cleared, I believe. So a little bit of an issue there with Adams, but obviously Cobb's still in a strong place this week. We've seen Cooper Kupp, Larry Fitzgerald take advantage of this slot matchup against Dallas over the last few weeks. And this is another spot where I think you're going to see that trend continue. Miami wideouts this week, good spot for really all 3 of them. Jarvis Landry, we'll see Logan Ryan, who's allowing a 69% catch rate this year. Good spot for Landry to rack him up on PPR sites like DraftKings. Devontae Parker, a little bit expensive on DK. Love his price tag over on FanDuel, where he is just 6,100. Going to be a popular wide receiver 3 this week, against a Tennessee secondary that's allowed the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers this season. If you're looking to be really contrarian, you want to roll a Kenny Stills. Adoree Jackson's been struggling a bit since entering the league, allowing 0.34 fantasy points per route run this year. Don't mind him, but he's basically just kind of a boomer bust home run threat. So good spot for him. A couple other names. Travis Benjamin, likely going to see some time with Eli Apple, which is actually the best matchup against the Giants that you can get as a wide receiver. So we'll talk Keenan Allen, we'll talk Tyrell Williams a little bit later, but they're in tough spots. Travis Benjamin, interesting flyer if you want to go that route in GPPs, but nothing more than that. T.Y. Hilton, good spot for him this week. I know Jacoby Brissett's still under center, but not bad. Andrew Luck's going to be gearing up in the next week or so. You look at 49ers, they've allowed the 6th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers this year. Hilton's going to line up against Rashard Robinson, Kwan Williams, two of the poor cornerbacks in the league. I don't think he's going to be super sneaky like he was against Cleveland, but I still think he's actually going to draw somewhat lower ownership. Golden Tate's another one this week I don't mind. Going to see Captain Munnerlyn, a guy who he's seen in the past when Munnerlyn was with Minnesota. He's allowed a 78% catch rate to wide receivers. Tate's averaging 0.35 fantasy points per route run. Decent for a slot guy like Tate. So once again, he's continuously the guy that gets kind of the coverage there, whereas Marvin Jones always sucks out those top end corners, which is always surprising. But Golden Tate in a decent spot and kind of somewhat of a lower price, especially over on FanDuel, 6,700. So definitely those guys stand out to me. In terms of mid-range options this week, or mid-range coverage options, AJ Green, Tre'Davious White, has been really impressive in his time at Buffalo so far this year. Holding opposing wiles to a 43% catch rate, just 0.16 fantasy points per route run against him. Green obviously still a tournament play, just given the fact that his volume is always going to be there. He's a freakish athlete, so when we look at things, obviously it's a small sample size for White, but this guy's kind of developing into a situation where I'm not really looking to target him all that much. I think that game's going to be really ugly and low scoring anyway. Definitely don't mind him in tournaments still, though, just given the fact that it's still AJ Green. Jordy Nelson kind of in a similar spot. Jordan Lewis has been pretty well. He grades out as an above average corner, holding opposing wiles to just a 0.22 fantasy points per route run. So, in that span, I don't mind Nelson this week. I think Cobb's obviously my preferred play, but Nelson's an intriguing option given the fact that he scored two touchdowns in each of the last 2 games, averaging 0.44 fantasy points per route run. And he's also being targeted 21% of the time. So definitely don't mind Nelson this week, but he kind of just sits in there in that mid-range as far as matchups go. If you're looking for some GPP guys you want to take a shot on, Marquise Lee, as long as he's fully healthy, even Allen Hurns. Marquise Lee is obviously an interesting one going up against Joe Hayden. Joe Haynes, one of the worst cornerbacks in Pittsburgh. Not that there's a whole knock against Hayden. I just never really got the appeal and love for him. He's always been a guy I didn't mind targeting, even though he's been a bigger name, but I feel like he's been a bigger name for wrong reasons. So I don't mind Lee in terms of just a GPP dart throw, especially if we can get some Bortles garbage time, given the fact that Pittsburgh's at home against this team. So you expect them to be up. You expect to be Bortles throwing most of the second half. I think Lee could be an interesting, game theory play for going that route. Robbie Anderson's another one. Jamar Taylor's, going to be covering him. He's allowed a 67% catch rate, 1.62 yards per route covered, 0.36 fantasy points per route run. Anderson's a boomer bust guy when you kind of look at things of how he is, but he's an interesting one. Jamar Taylor obviously got torched by T.Y. Hilton a few weeks ago. He's been a guy I don't mind targeting. It won't be one that I continue to target moving forward. So I like Anderson this week in terms of just a GPP threat. That's about it for me on him. When we start to look at some of these other options in this mid-range, Sterling Shepard, Rashard Matthews are interesting plays this week, especially if Marcus Mariota can return. Matthews, decent spot there against Byron Maxwell. Not a bad corner, but not a great one either. When we look at Shepard, he's going up against Desmond King, who's filling in for a banged up San Diego secondary or Los Angeles secondary. 85% catch rate allowed. Sterling Shepard's been a guy who they've kind of used as like a short running attack. And I know with Paul Perkins out, I don't expect Giants to really be running the ball all that much. When you look at things throwing the ball over 40 times per game, I know OBJ is getting about 13 to 15 targets out of those 40, but between Ingram and Shepard and Marshall, there's still plenty enough to go around at this point. So really a decent spot for Shepard. I think if Shepard was more heavily used, he'd be a guy that I definitely like more. But I definitely don't mind taking a few stabs at him in tournaments. So Doug Baldwin, he got a full practice in this week. He's going up against the Rams. Looking at Nickel Roby-Coleman, a guy, who did pretty well in Buffalo. They obviously traded him in the offseason. It's not a great matchup. Coleman's kind of held his own this year, but obviously Rams are allowing 86 receiving yards per game to wide receiver ones. Baldwin's average 0.41 fantasy points per route run. He's still one of the more solid options. This game might actually have some sneaky potential just in terms of overall fantasy production on both sides with Gurley and Russell Wilson. The passing game, I don't really hate this one. Targeting it kind of looks ugly on paper, but it could actually be a little bit sneaky this week. So moving into lockdown coverage, we're going to look at Devin Funchess and Kelvin Benjamin. Really, I mean, Detroit's been very impressive. Second DVOA against wide receiver 2s, 11th against wide receiver 1s. I know Nevin Lawson's a guy we've picked on in the past. He's going to line up against basically whatever Funchess and, whoever they're not dodging Darius Slay with. Kelvin Benjamin, Devin Funchess will see some, both will see some Darius Slay. A guy that I don't really like to pick on. I feel like Funchess is a little bit priced up for my taste on DraftKings. I don't mind him in terms of shots and GPPs because the target share is starting to pop up with Greg Olsen being down. FanDuel, he's not a bad option either, 6,300. I just, he might be a decent pivot off away from Parker. But Funchess, I mean, for the most part, is going to be lining up against Slay. It's not really a spot that I'm intrigued with. I don't actually think Carolina is going to be a great offense this week, even though they look good against New England last week. But I think that was just more of a matchup thing. So, not really eyeing in on this matchup. I think this is going to be one that I tend to fade for the most part outside of a share or two. Then we kind of get to some bigger names here. Antonio Brown, Jalen Ramsey, big showdown between, obviously one of the league's best wide receivers against he's been one of the league's best cornerbacks as well. Look at Jacksonville, third in DVOA against wide receiver 1s, 21st against wide receiver 2s. You can take some shots with Martavis Bryant GBPs. We've seen a couple of long balls just miss him and go for those big touchdowns. But when you look at Ramsey, I mean, allowing a 49% catch rate, 0.21 fantasy points per run. Brown still obviously playable, but I'm going to be kind of just limiting my exposure this week and going with the Bell train and going that route. Odell Beckham in a tough spot as well. Casey Hayward's played incredibly well. If OBJ is not 100%, I think we do need to scale back some. But obviously, he's one of those guys where he's going to get 13 to 15 targets a game, have that 100-plus yard, 2-touchdown upside. So when you look at OBJ, obviously he's strong, 0.49 fantasy points per route run. But when you look at Hayward, I mean, been very solid. I mean, over the last basically year and a half, 0.22 fantasy points per route run against him. Those are strong numbers. So definitely a tough spot. I think OBJ still kind of overshadows him just a little bit. But I definitely wouldn't be surprised if OBJ gets taken out maybe a little bit, especially if he's not 100%. So sticking with the NFC East matchups, Keenan Allen, obviously heading into New York. Going to be a tough spot for Allen this week. Sees Dominique Rodgers-Cromartie, sees some Janoris Jenkins. Those are two guys I don't really like to pick on. Both have allowed under 0.25 fantasy points per route run this season. Tyrell Williams is also going to be someone who sees some Janoris Jenkins where, maybe one of those guys can get away and see some Eli Apple at times, but it looks like Travis Benjamin's going to be lined up against him the most, which I think is an intriguing dart throw given Apple's been absolutely horrendous this year. So when you look at this, I think Allen, I think Williams, I know Williams had the big week. I wasn't really on him last week. I think both those guys are going to be looking to be stayaways for me. This is still a very good secondary. Eli Apple's just basically been the picking point at this through 4 weeks here. So another one here, Jeremy Maclin. He's really cheap on DraftKings. I don't mind him there, 4,200. I think the workload is still going to be enough to kind of get him by. But TJ Carey's actually not been that bad, holding wide receivers to 0.26 fantasy points per run and a 57% catch rate. Not exactly an ideal matchup for Maclin, especially with Joe Flacco, who's been god-awful this year. That offense in general has just been bad. So I think this could be a bad week really for that game in general. I know Mark Cooper's on the other side of that one too. Him and Michael Crabtree I'm not really looking at. Baltimore ranks first in DVOA against wide receiver 1s, third against wide receiver 2s. Big downgrade with EJ Manuel there as well. So definitely looking to kind of fade those names. Also, Patrick Peterson treatment is going to be with Alshon Jeffrey. Peterson just doesn't get targeted. He's one of the reasons why I think you can look at other options like Ertz and Aguilar, maybe Torrey Smith if you want to go that route. But when you look at Peterson, he just doesn't get targeted. that pushes Matthew and Patel over 20% of the targets. The season also holds wide receivers to under 0.20 fantasy points per route run. So not really looking to use him this week, rather much use the secondary options. So that's going to wrap it up for me. If I missed someone that you're looking at this week and you want to know, just pop in the comment section or find me on Twitter, and I'll definitely get back to you on that. So once again, if you want to check out the article, it is up over on dailyfantasycafe.com. And good luck in week 5.